about how many people here have had patients with the same diagnosis, yet having completely different treatment outcomes, okay? So it's a common thing we see in clinic, of course. We apply the same treatment to the same label, but we get a lot of different outcomes. So either our patients are messing with us or there's something about the model that we don't quite understand, okay? So that's what we're going to talk about today. Now, I brought it up in the context of depression so that we could have a container to have this discussion, okay? But just know that we're going to talk about a few other conditions as well, and that this applies to other diagnoses as well. Okay, so we'll get past this. We've got our disclaimer here for educational purposes and the boring stuff here, but let's get into the good stuff. So when we talk about a diagnosis, it's very important. It helps us name suffering and it helps us give us a language around communication, okay? But it doesn't exactly tell us why the symptoms are happening. It tells us about groups and how we group people together, and it can tell us about distress, but it doesn't tell us how the brain is functioning, and it can't predict how treatment will actually work. So let's take this for an example. Okay, this is a pretty common example we see where we have two patients come in with the same PHQ score. Okay, so our depression rating score, same diagnosis, but different symptoms. Okay, over here we have overwhelmedness, brain fog, fatigue, decision troubles. On patient B, we have racing thoughts where they can't shut off, they're irritable, and they have poor sleep. So we have patients with completely divergent symptoms, but the same diagnosis and the same score. So if you actually sat with them, would we treat them the same? But yet that's what our model tells us to do, okay? And this is how that system works, okay? The system works with, of course, our diagnosis, or DSM label, and then our first line treatment. Okay, so we go through this model, this diagnose, treat, wait, adjust, and repeat. And this is where we've been trained. And this is where the providers sit in this model between the diagnosis and the first line treatment. But let me ask you, how many times do you think a patient can go through this loop before they start to lose hope? Okay, and there was a post the other day on LinkedIn, and it was about veterans going through this loop, and it caught my attention. And I was talking to the individual about this model and how people go through this loop and how much hopelessness and despair this can create. And importantly, how many times can you go through this loop as a provider before you start to feel like you're guessing? So we've built this entire system on one assumption, and that's that people who share a diagnosis share the same biology. But what if that isn't true? What if the reality is that we group these individuals by what they report, not actually how the brain is functioning? And so what you end up with is a large degree of diagnostic homogeneity at the surface level, which masks what's actually going on biologically, okay? So cardiology gets this, okay? We measure the heart. Endocrinology gets it. We measure the hormones. But in psychiatry, we treat the brain without measuring it. And psychiatry remains one of the only fields in medicine that still does this, that practices treating the organ without testing it. So if we look at this in cardiology, every field, for example, in cardiology, has a step between symptoms and treatment, okay? So in cardiology, we have chest pain, we have an EKG, and we have our treatment, okay? Test, confirm, treat. And we repeat that. We can repeat at the end and confirm our test and our treatment's working, okay? But of course, in mental health, we don't have that. We have our symptoms, and then we have this missing gap in the middle, and then we have our treatment. And what we rely on is this iterative approximation, which is a neat word for sort of like guessing, okay? Where we make our assumption, we go back and see how our assumption panned out, and then we come back and hopefully refine that model as we go along, okay? And this is a model that you guys as providers have been forced to work with for a long time, and it's amazing what a good job you guys do with that missing layer in the middle. So we know the DSM is useful. It gives us a language to discuss and to share and to be able to communicate together, but it's just a map. It's not actually the underlying biology. It doesn't give us the mechanisms. So again, in cardiology, chest pain can mean a number of different things, right? It can mean ischemia, it can mean muscle strain, it can mean reflux, but it never dictates the treatment, okay? It never dictates the treatment. And again, the reality is that psychiatry is the only profession that still routinely treats the organ without measuring it, okay? So two patients can have the same label, will have entirely different neurophysiology underneath, okay? And this is what that looks like. So we have major depressive disorder, of course, our conversation for today, is the tip of this iceberg, okay? It's just the end of it, okay? But what we're actually trying to measure is much more, deep, is what's going on underneath, okay? So I like this line, symptoms overlap, but biology doesn't, okay? And this is where everything changes. This is where we go from, F32.9 to actually understanding the underlying biology and the underlying brain patterns, okay? So this is what it looks like in practice. So how brain mapping comes in is where we move from a flat signal, okay, like these squiggly lines here, okay? This is a basic EEG outline. I equate that to looking at a mountain range. It's like taking a picture of the Front Range, okay, here in Colorado. And the QEEG is taking that Front Range image and turning it into almost like a flyover. It's like you're flying over the mountains and you can see the depth and the height and the disbursement of all the mountains, okay? And that's what we want to do. We want to move from this flat signal to a map of how the brain is actually functioning, okay? So not just what's wrong, but how is it wrong, okay? So what we're trying to do with EEG and QEEG, which is the quantification of that EEG signal, is to actually reveal how individual brains and regions interact, okay? And that helps us to pull apart the heterogeneity in these conditions. So this is where it gets real. This is where we see it in real life, okay? This is, I know we're talking about depression, but this is a good example here of an 8-year-old boy who's diagnosed with ADHD and who's not responding to treatment, okay? This comes up all the time. So this individual is given a stimulant, is not responding to treatment. Our classic ADHD profile here is this sort of frontal slowing, okay? ADHD can show up a lot of different ways, but for the purposes of our conversation, we'll talk about the frontal slowing subtype, okay? But what happens, whoops, let me go back. What happens when we actually scan this individual is that we see that they have what looks more like a sleep disorder with a global slow dominance, okay? Not your hyperactivity, not your frontal slowing, okay, that we might expect from our classic ADHD, okay? So this is where things become complicated, is that if we don't have that information, we may miss it completely. And so on the outside, we have the same symptoms, okay, ADHD, but underneath we have an entirely different brain, which results in an entirely different solution, okay? And this helps us to see why treatment could fail even before we begin, okay? And so what we're trying to do, of course, is to tailor our interventions to a patient's specific neurological profiles. And I want to be clear too that we're not here to try to replace you or replace the providers. What we're trying to do is add a layer, that layer I showed you before in that other slide, that's missing to make you guys more effective. Okay, so here's another one, okay? This is this paradox of a shared label. I like this slide because it really sort of spells it out well in how we see it in real life, okay? So we have two patients, identical symptom clusters, okay? Panic, social avoidance, school refusal, okay?
Oh dear, you start OB. Sorry. That's okay.
Cassie, can you hit the mute, please? And so we have identical standard of care. So we have the same symptom clusters, the same standard of care, but totally different hardware. So we have our symptoms, we have our GAD-7 scores, our standardized questionnaire, we have our standard of care, which is an SSRI. But when we look at their brain patterns, we have totally different profiles. Okay. So what do you think happens if we treat these people the same? I mean, people, of course, the providers that we work with, would know the answer to that is that one's likely going to get worse. And so we want to know that information before we get into the treatment. So when we start to see this, it's actually what it looks like is a spectrum. Okay. We have some brains that are underactive, some brains that are overactive. Okay. We have some brains that have connectivity and coherence issues with how the brain talks to itself. And we have some brains that perform poorly under load. And so suddenly what happens is that we're not treating diagnosis anymore. We're treating patterns. So our discussions in clinic and collaboration, and when we talk about patients, becomes about patterns, okay? And so what we're trying to do here with QEEG is to look at the heterogeneity of these psychiatric conditions and reveal what's actually going on biologically, okay? So we go from these underactive brains, which is commonly associated with treatment resistance, to subtyping things like ADHD, when we get into a little faster patterns, to PTSD and trauma, to my area of interest here, which is suicidality, predicting suicidality, and anxiety. And so we can see these things on a spectrum, and that's how we look at these patterns, okay? And this is what sits underneath of depression, okay? So this is, if we come back to depression, oops, let me go back. We come back to depression, what ends up happening is that underneath this sort of monolithic layer or label of depression, we have about 7 different profiles. And for the purposes of this conversation, I kept it to 7, okay? We actually could probably look at another dozen or so more, but I wanted to keep it digestible here. So we look at these through these 3 different axes, okay? We have energy and demand. We have on the corner there, we have stimulation and looping. And then my favorite, which is biases and processing. So we'll get into that one in a minute, but that one has to do with filters. And it's really an interesting way we sort of interpret our environment. So every patient that we see sits somewhere in this space, okay? So it's not necessarily a category like a label, but it's more in terms of like a pattern, okay? So we're not looking for the label. What we're actually trying to do is place individuals on a map, okay? So not one condition, but actually multiple measurable brain states. And most people are sort of a combination of all of these, okay? So when we get into our first section, okay, at the top of this energy and demand axis, we look at the top of the map and we start with the energy, because the way we look at it is that if the brain can't meet the demand, pretty much everything else downstream begins to fall apart, okay? And that's what we see in real life too, is that these 2 patterns, when they're present in the brain scans of the patients, really seems to sort of throw everything else off, okay? And that tends to be our starting point. So these are the patients that tend to say things like, I'm overwhelmed, or I shut down, or I can't think. Again, labels depression, but the nuances there are these sorts of conversations that we're having, okay? So if we look at this low PDR subtype of depression, okay, which has to do with how we process information, it's kind of like our brain's processing speed. If that number is low, we tend to see an overall low arousal. It sort of starts low and it ends low, okay? And when we load it, it'll start to shut down, okay? So this could be sort of equated to, I always think of like working off of an older iPhone. It's like it'll do the job, but it's really nice when we got the fast ones. They just tend to kind of do everything a little bit better, okay? Now this again will look like depression in clinic, but it's different than this pattern over here, which is the demand task cognitive slowing pattern, okay? This is what we refer to as the overwhelmed pattern. And so this pattern may have a baseline of arousal that's high, meaning that they can sort of look attentive and sort of function okay at baseline. But when there's a demand, some unexpected occurrence, some change in routine, divorce, something happens, their brain slows down. Okay, I saw two of these already today. Okay, where this happened in patients. Okay, and that's what happens. Their environment changes and their brain sort of shuts down. Okay, and then they're looking for compensatory mechanisms to sort of scratch those itches. So we see a lot of things like substance use in this population. We see a lot of escapism, doom scrolling, things like that to sort of check out. Okay, so these people will often avoid um, like new situations, things that could be risky, and so forth. Okay, in the overwhelm pattern. So one thing I want to clarify is that in this subgroup, okay, in these two, it's not an issue with motivation. Okay, it's quite literally a brain that can't meet its demand. Okay, we're going to talk about the husky analogy here in a minute, which is one of my favorites. And the husky analogy is basically it's kind of like, I think Einstein said something like, if you judge a fish by how well it can climb a tree, it's something like that. But it's basically, my version of it is the husky, where the husky in the desert, is struggling. If you assess that husky in the desert, it's going to struggle. It's going to look lazy. It's going to look like it doesn't want to play. But if you assess that husky in the snow in Winter Park, and it's out playing with the sled, that dog isn't going to want to come in. And so this is really important to understand how the environment shapes how these patterns manifest. Okay, so if we're in low demand environment, these people may be fine. This doesn't have to be something that you treat. It doesn't have to be something pathological. But when the energy of the system doesn't meet the demand of the environment, that's when we start to see symptoms. Okay, and we'll get into that in a minute. So remember, we're at the top of this energy axis. We're going to come down here to I think the stimulation loop one's next. Yeah, here it is. So again, another subtype we see of depression. Okay, so this is going to be our sort of bored, distractible, needs a lot of stimulation to engage, but nothing feels interesting. Okay, these are the what we call high theta beta ratio folks. Okay, these are people that have more slow waves than fast waves, and we measure that ratio. And when it's elevated, it can manifest as depression. Sorry, I keep bumping the slides. These tend to be very highly creative people as well, but they're not going to respond to your typical antidepressant treatments. Okay, it's very important to know that going in. Now, let's contrast this with the high alpha beta ratio folks, which are more of the ruminative folks. Okay, these are the people who become mentally stuck. They're engaged almost like a car who's in neutral, but they're not able to process information. Okay, they can't stop thinking. They get sort of stuck in these loops. Again, same label, totally different underlying physiology, totally different approaches, whether it's medication, whether it's therapy, or whether it's environment. There's going to be different needs with these brain patterns. Okay, same label, opposite problems. So now we'll go to the other side of that triangle I was showing you back here. Let me go back. So we did the top two over in the bias and processing section of that triangle. We're now here to the filters. Now the filters are one of my favorite areas. I could spend the whole time just talking about these filters. These filters are really interesting, okay? They have to do with how we understand the interpretation of our environment. So we understood initially how the brain processes demands. Now we need to understand how it interprets what's happening around it. Because two brains can have the exact same experience, okay? We can walk hand in hand, eat the same thing, go to the same places, talk to the same people. But with these filters, it's going to be interpreted differently. So the analogy I often think of is like, my wife comes in the house, it's 72 degrees and she's hot, and I'm cold. And so we change the thermostat, and it's like, well, we're both right. We're just interpreting the environment differently through our filters. Okay. And that's an easy one to relate to because it has to do with, body temperature. But the same thing happens with the brain patterns. Okay. So when we have someone that has what's called frontal alpha asymmetry, they have a negative external bias. Okay, their brain is shaped for a negative external bias. Again, labeled as depression. This is another subtype. So these people tend to be more threat focused. They're sensitive to external stressors, and they interpret the world and the things around them more negatively. Okay, again, in their most expressive form, these can be some of the harder people to sort of be around. They tend to, kind of complain more, okay? And it's real to them because they're interpreting the world through this frontal alpha asymmetry, okay? Okay, so now let's see. So now the posterior alpha asymmetry. Now this is a really interesting one. This is a newer marker that we started measuring a few years ago. This one takes that negative filter but internalizes it towards oneself. So these are your patients, and if this is yourself, maybe even too, that tend to sort of take the blame for things like I'm no good, or there's a lot of shame associated with this pattern, a lot of perfectionism too. So we see this in high achievers. We see this in people, I have friends with these patterns that have published hundreds and hundreds of studies, written tons of books, and it's largely driven by this perfectionistic pattern. Of course, we have external experiences and things that happen to us, and trauma and all this stuff. But again, if we're just looking at these symptoms through the filter of these brain filters, it can really explain a lot of how people make decisions about what they do, and how they respond to criticisms and so forth. But again, the posterior alpha asymmetry, we tend to see a lot of that negative internal criticism, or negative self-reflection, we call it. Okay. In the right environment, this can be a fantastic pattern. Okay, we see a lot of high achievers, professional athletes, people that are really driven with this pattern, but it tends to come from this place of sort of negative self-referencing. And last but not least, as it pertains to these filters here, we're going to talk about the Mu rhythm. Now, the Mu rhythm is one of my favorite patterns. We've published, I think, papers on most of these. Mu rhythm was one of my first papers in 2009 when we were studying autism. And the Mu rhythm tends to show up a lot indirectly now, as we see more and more around neurodivergence, okay? And we see this pattern commonly as a filter of social cues where there can be a block. It has to do with the mirror neuron system, okay? It's kind of a complicated process, but basically these individuals tend to have trouble in large groups, tend to have trouble picking up on social cues, okay? And when that happens, it can feel disconnected. And what interesting side note is we did a presentation about 2 years ago on a gentleman who was in his 80s who had treatment-resistant depression, and we did a scan, found he had a Mu rhythm, treated the Mu rhythm, or treated the patterns, in his skin, and completely resolved, his symptoms, and he was in his 80s, and I tend to think of him every couple of weeks or so, and just think about how different his life might have been had he found out that information earlier, and we had been able to help him with personalized treatment, but also just creating an environment that supports him and validates his lived experience. But yeah, so this Mu rhythm here in large social situations and so forth can really not feel so great. And so again, it can feel like depression, and it's another sort of subtype that we'll see. And when that need is met, and when that itch is scratched, that's when we see people improve. So it isn't necessarily a personality trait per se, but it's a way that external situations and things get filtered. Okay, so that's their processing filter. So this slide is kind of complicated, but it's complicated for a reason. Okay, and this is what depression actually looks like when we look at it through the lens of the EEG. Okay, and suddenly it becomes not one condition, but multiple distinct brain patterns, all hiding under the same label. Okay, so this is the nuts and bolts of it. Okay, and so we talked about a number of these, and I'll get into these in a minute, but I just want you to think about something for a second. Okay, and we're going to do a little math between this slide and the next slide. If you were to take all 7 of these patterns, there's 2, 4, 6, 7, okay, 7 of these patterns, and look at the combinations of these patterns. I had to ask a middle schooler to help me with this math problem, okay? And so you take any combination of these, you end up with, I think it's 128, if I remember correctly. Someone can do the math, it's 2 to the 7th. 128, okay? And so they're all coming in with a label depression, but we have 128 different possible combinations that you guys are expected to help support through therapy, through lifestyle interventions, through over-the-counter formulas, through diet, through medications. It's amazing. It's an amazing job that you guys do with the limited tools that you've had up until now, okay? And so if we look at these through these different filters, and again, we're saying this is, the presentation is depression, we can talk about the low PDR subtype. These are the individuals who come in that are completely overwhelmed and exhausted. These are a low energy all the time folks, okay? This is a very common pattern to be labeled treatment resistant, okay? This is very common. That pattern responds very poorly to most medications. If you don't know it's there. If you know it's there, it's a different story, okay? But if you don't, and you're scratching your head trying to help your patient, that might be one of the reasons. Oops, sorry, I keep bumping this. Let me go back. Okay, so high theta beta, we talked about this one. This is our sort of underengaged baseline. These are things, where the world isn't really interesting. It's not stimulating enough. See a lot of artists with this pattern, okay? Again, looks like depression. Often in females, by the way, too. We published a paper on this, I think, 2 years ago. And it was, we were looking at how many women were coming in labeled as depressed, but actually had brains that look more like ADHD. And so, so we wrote a paper about it because it kept happening so much. So these are the people, again, that sort of artist pattern. These are usually my creatives, but not responding to typical depression treatments, okay? Then we have our high alpha beta ratio folks. Okay, these are that ruminative group I was talking about before, that kind of thought loop, stuck in neutral group. Okay, so they're engaged, but it's a disconnection. It's a ruminative. These are people that tend to do worse with things like alcohol and THC. Okay, and so it's again very important to know that, because if they have that pattern, that can open up the discussion about what are you doing when you're not in the office? What are you doing to to check out? What are you doing on the weekends? And you can start to have those conversations with data that says, hey, I think we might want to stop drinking. I think that might be making these patterns worse. In fact, I had that same conversation today with the patient who had those patterns. Okay, so the demand test cognitive slowing. Okay, this is one of my favorite patterns. This is a pattern we discovered about 7 or 8 years ago, and it's where the brain actually slows down under load. It's kind of like a computer that has had too many windows open and it's freezing. Okay, and we can measure that. It's a really interesting pattern. I think there's some association here with trauma as well, and so that's for another time. But the demand test cognitive slowing pattern is a pattern that again may look good at baseline, but when situations change, the school schedule changes or the relationship changes, the job changes, these sorts of things, that's when the screws get sort of turned on that pattern. And those people are going to be looking for ways to sort of check out. And so they may shut down, they may, engage in conflict. But a lot of times we see substance use as a means, a sort of self-medicating means. And frankly, if you don't see it, that could invite a conversation around that too. So I see you have this pattern that sort of slows down under load. Tell me, how does that look for you? What does that look like in your life when you are under demand? And then you can start to have these conversations, okay? Frontal left asymmetry, now we're getting into those filters that we talked about. That's where the external world is a threat. These tend to be more empathic people too. So we see more like bleeding hearts, first responders, caregivers, that kind of thing. These are people who tend to be in those kinds of roles. And that can serve that pattern. Again, none of these are bad. If I didn't emphasize this enough, none of these are bad. They're only a problem when the environment doesn't support the patterns, okay? So frontal alpha asymmetry, posterior alpha asymmetry, that's the negative self-talk. Okay, I'm no good, I'm a failure. We see a lot of that negative guilt that comes with that too. And again, if you see that pattern, it's a very stable marker. When it shows up, that's when we start to have the conversations with these patients. We say, tell me about your self-talk. Tell me about your gratitude practice. Tell me about, the wins you're getting every day. Okay. Again, we see this in a lot of our athletes, and that can be if that's a group you work with, that can be a really good conversation starter with, like, how to use your self-talk go when when the game isn't going your way, or when you make a mistake or get a penalty. Okay. And last but not least, the mu. Okay, so mu rhythm, written off commonly in neurology and psychiatry. It's a very common pattern to see in patients presenting with psychiatric concerns in general. Okay, that's what we found in our review paper. But more specifically, it tends to be associated with what we call social cognitive processing deficits, where people have a harder time in the bigger groups with eye contact, with social cues. Okay, and when that happens, it can be exhausting to be in those groups. So these are the people who are, not usually going to the big parties and so forth. And again, it's not like a deficit per se of them or a problem with them. It's just understanding where their patterns fit into the bigger ecosystem. Okay. So again, the point of all of this is that it's not one condition. It's many distinct patterns hiding under one label. Okay. So if we get into that here, we take these small, this looks like a complicated slide, but it's actually pretty easy. We take these small measurable signals, we can actually measure thousands of different profiles. So to make this easier, I was just talking about the 7, okay, in this sort of conceptual, a way, but we're actually measuring over a dozen patterns that we report on. And if you take a dozen patterns, or 2 to the 12th power, you get over 4,096 to be exact, different functional profiles. You guys, like, if you can just fathom that, like every patient that comes in with a depression label, that 5 people all agreed is the diagnosis is accurate. They have 4,096 different profiles that you could measure, that you can see, that make each of them unique and that will influence how they respond to treatment. Okay, and help you understand if the next treatment you decide to do will be helpful or not. Okay, so important. And that's only in the 12 that we measure. We actually gather, or the 12 that we report on, we actually measure thousands. Like if you've never seen an entire Excel spreadsheet filled, that's what it looks like when we do an EEG recording and turn it into to numbers. We turn the squiggly lines, like the other picture I showed you, into numbers. And when you do that, you get these enormous Excel tables. And it's very naive to think that we fully understand this. It's like there's so much more going on when we lift up the hood. So again, we have a lot of these different patterns that we measure, and we're trying to take this narrative of the DSM and turn it into these networks and these patterns, so that we can start to make sense of what's going on with that patient in front of you. Okay. So let's see. So when you combine just a handful of these markers, most people are 2, 3 markers. You don't just have one type of depression anymore. You have thousands. Okay, that's my point. So if two patients can have completely different brain functions and we give them the same diagnosis, my question for you then is, what are we actually treating? And that took me a minute to kind of think about, like what are we actually treating? Because we're not treating the brain at that point. We're treating the description of the patient's experience. That's what we're treating. And for some patients, it clearly works. It clearly works. We've been doing this for a while, okay? But for some, and the ones that don't respond, this is probably what's missing. It's probably some of these patterns that we don't know, okay? So this slide is interesting. I really like this slide. It's what I call the math of misery. This is the 12 different patterns to 2 to the 12th power, and this is what you end up with. Okay, so if you had any patients who have been on 2, 3, 4 medications and still struggling, it's probably not because you chose wrong. It's probably because you didn't have enough information to actually choose what was right. Okay, and so like we say here, polypharmacy, it isn't a failure of the clinician. It's just an inevitability from the mathematical, combination of all these different patterns in a symptom-based system. Try saying that fast. Symptom-based system. Okay, it's just math. And so when we apply the same interventions to biologically different systems, we don't get precision, we get probability. That's where that iterative approximation comes in again from the beginning, okay? And that probability is where I think is where suffering lies, okay? It's that guessing game that we've been sort of stuck in and forced to do since we haven't had data. So I think it's fair to say that most of what we call treatment resistance isn't actually treatment resistance. It's probably more model resistance. And it isn't that the treatment it isn't that the patient is failing the treatment. It's more like the model is failing the patient. Okay. So let's simplify what we've been talking about here for a second. Okay. And I want to be clear that when someone has 4,096 different combinations, we don't need to treat or cure all of those. What we need to do is match the biology to the environment. Okay. And by environment, I know that sounds elusive, but it means the internal and the external environment. We need to match the internal and external environment. And when those things don't align, that's when we get clinical expression. Okay. That's what, and illusion, don't get me wrong here. I don't mean that psychiatric diseases are an illusion, but it's not necessarily a pathological disease. It's a mismatch because in one environment, you can have an individual who thrives. You change that environment, the same brain patterns, and now they're struggling. Okay, what's changed? Well, what's changed is their environment. So biology plus environment creates what we call symptoms. So the anxiety, the overwhelm, the depression, it's not random. It's a very predictable output of how the brain is wired and what we're asking it to do. Okay. So if you've ever had a patient who's looked completely different in a different environment, less anxious, more engaged, more themselves, it's the same brain. It's a different environment. And we see this a lot when people go through transitions, especially like kids out of high school, marriage, moving in together, kids leaving the house, retirement, all these transitions. They're big times for these patterns to have been working at one point and then they stop working. Okay. And it's like the brain didn't change, the environment changed. Okay. So you can take a perfectly capable brain, put it in the wrong environment, and it'll start to look like a disorder. Okay. And so that's where we get this husky analogy or this husky phenomenon. Okay. It's my favorite. So two little huskies here. And when we take them to Arizona, they're miserable. Okay. But when we take them to Winter Park, they're great. And that's because they have a double coat, they have lots of energy, and they like to run around in the snow. Okay. But in the desert, they look like a problem. Okay. So it's not that the dog is broken, it's a mismatch between the environment. So these brain deviations, and this is key, are not pathologies. They're just symptoms when those traits are forced to be in an environment in which they don't, or they don't fit. Okay. So let me show you how this might look in real life. So here's another example. So we have an individual with, say, a high processing speed, which we can measure. We talked about that. We have someone with, say, a high theta beta ratio. We talked about that. And we put an environmental demand on them that requires them to sit still for 8 hours. Now, who does that sound like? That kind of sounds to me like a GT kid, like a kid who's got high processing speed, high theta beta ratio, and they're forced to sit still in school for 8 hours. And then we call them hyperactive, defiant, or anxious. Okay. But when we push the environmental demand that matches, such as a high stimulating environment, active problem solving, we see rapid innovation and high energy focus. And I think this is where we could use this information to really tailor our IEPs, our 504s, our experiential learning schools, our Waldorf schools, these sorts of kind of unique learning environments so that we can match them to these individual brain patterns. Okay. So we're not necessarily trying to medicate the trait away. Okay. We're just trying to optimize and build this resilience in that environment. Okay. So I really like this slide. Okay. And so once you see this, the way that we practice really has to change. Okay. We move from a symptom-based care to more of a pattern-based care. So the basis of assessment, subjective checklist, over to neurophysiological measurements. Okay, the goal over in the symptom-based is to suppress symptoms and standardize a normative state. Okay. Over here, what we're trying to do is match biological traits to an environmental mismatch. Okay. Treatment approach, trial and error. Okay. And over here, we're using precision targeted specific brain networks. Okay. Over here, my brain is broken and I have a lifelong disease versus my brain works differently and I need a different environment. And again, this is where we see a lot of this neurodivergent conversations landing lately. Okay, is that it's not necessarily unbroken, it just works different. And I think they're creating a nice language for us to talk about that globally, not just this sort of small subgroup. I really think this pertains to sort of everybody. And the ones of us who are functioning well have found that environment. They've found that husky environment for you, okay? And when you're not in that husky environment, it's when we tend to have those symptoms, okay? So once this shift happens, that's when all the questions we ask has to change too, okay? So instead of asking, what diagnosis is this? We start to ask, what pattern is driving this, okay? So it doesn't replace the diagnosis. The diagnosis is still very important to have that shared conversation and understanding and so forth, okay? But it adds a layer of biological understanding that stops us from having to guess so much. And frankly, creates a lot of burnout on the provider side too. It's exhausting. It's exhausting for me. It's frankly why I do little clinical work now, because it's just so hard to do that without having that layer of biological data. So I chose to, live behind the screen and do most of my work on these brain scans. So, because the diagnosis here tells you what this looks like, but the patterns are actually telling you what's happening and what we want to do about it. So once you start asking that question, everything downstream becomes more precise. Just like we talked about, every field of medicine measures the organ before we treat it. Mental health is now finally starting to move in that same direction. We spent decades refining labels, and now we're starting to measure function. Okay, because again, once you can measure the brain objectively, we no longer have that trial and error. We're targeting. Okay, and eventually this becomes standard of care, and that's what we're trying to move towards. So we're no longer stacking medications and trying to cover up the outcomes. We are avoiding this math of misery layer that we talked about before. We're not prescribing contradictory medications. I mean, how many of you guys have patients like this who come in on uppers or downers? This sort of Red Bull and vodka scenario, which drives me absolutely bonkers, and tells me is a clue that we don't know what's going on with this patient physiologically, and two, it's well, they just can. No one can feel good being on uppers and downers all day. You're taking your stimulants in the morning, your sleeping pills at night. We're likely treating some patterns or trying to treat patterns that we don't know that are there, and it's creating this sort of undesirable state for the patients. So now we can have these more targeted biological mapping to reduce trial and error and hopefully increase outcomes, and improve quicker outcomes. So fewer side effects, faster improvements. So the old question was, what diagnosis does this patient meet? Okay, that's where we lived for forever. Okay, but now that leads to more. Now that leads to more of a symptom management and a more reactive, trial and error over there. Okay, so that's what we've done for years. But the new question is what underlying biological pattern is driving these symptoms? And that leads us to interventions that are pattern aligned in precision medicine, okay? Because the answer to that new question, there's no subjective checklist, we don't need that anymore, And so we really have to start measuring the organ, okay? So future of mental health isn't more categories, okay? Despite what the revisions of the DSM might have us thinking, it's better measurement, okay? We can still use the categorical approach to have these conversations, okay? It's not about faster labeling, even with AI and all these promises that we'll use AI to help us with faster labeling. It's more about a deeper understanding, and if we apply the same principles that we're doing now in this system to AI, we're just going to scale a sort of flawed system. Okay, what we need to do is start looking under the hood and understanding deeper what's going on with our patients. Okay, because once you see the way the brain is functioning and you stop managing the symptoms, you start guiding them and you start creating ecosystems for our patients. Okay, and when you combine that, the right environment, the right therapy, the right support, the care becomes more precise, you become more efficient, and there's a lot more validation. Okay, and so that's what I hear from a lot of patients when we're doing this work, is that they feel validated. This finally makes me feel validated, and this can be great for those patients who are stuck. Okay, so this is all grounded by evidence. Okay, there's lots of evidence, including a number of papers we publish, including our 2023 paper on suicidality prediction. Okay, there's some other good papers in there too, from EEG biomarkers to treatment response to network connectivity, all kinds of things in here. Okay, there's some good stuff if you want to dive in. But it isn't really about the research per se. It's more about how you see this in your patients and how you can work with the patients who the diagnosis didn't fully explain what was going on. The treatment didn't work and something didn't add up. Okay, so what are we going to do with these people right now? Can you take this information and go and sit down and start to think about what patterns might be driving, their symptoms when you see them tomorrow? Okay, so most clinics don't start, in this changing everything all at once. Okay, what you need to do is just start with the next patient you see, the next one who isn't getting better, and start to think about what's going on, when you see the brain, and start to understand how this explains what you've been seeing. Okay, and so once you do that, we don't tend to go back. So a lot of what I shared today is outlined in my book. Okay, my book came out last week. It's doing great on Amazon. It's actually #1 in psychiatry right now. And so if you want to take a deeper dive into that, go right ahead. But that's what this is all about, and shifting that perspective. So yeah, so I thank you for joining and listening to me talk about my favorite topic here. And I will be happy to entertain any questions if anyone's still with us this evening. And I know Cassie will tell us about the next talk that's coming up here next quarter.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Steve. Oh my goodness. Fascinating.
Thank you.
So yes, our next webinar series will be July 21st. I'll send more information on that, but it's going to be Dr. Scott Shannon, one of our co-founders, and he's going to discuss integrative medicine, meeting psychedelic medicine, and why the two going hand in hand is very important for the folks that we're treating on the psychedelic spectrum. And we actually have a couple of questions in the chat. I'll go ahead and read those off. And then if anyone else has other questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, or you can raise your virtual hand. Daniela Gerard asked, can we send patients to you for QEEG? Would you be willing to just do the QEEG and then send them back to us for continued treatment? How often / how many times would they need to come for the QEEG? Ballpark, of course, it will be patient dependent.
Yeah, I mean, we collaborate with providers like that all of the time. And so, yeah, you don't have to go in and learn all this stuff overnight. It's complicated. I mean, frankly, it's all I do. And so, yeah, you're more than invited to do that. And we love collaborating with other providers. Okay. And I think that's, key to all of this is to really understand. I mean, you know that patient way better than we do. So, yeah, we can give you that layer of objective data, send them back to you, and help you, continue care with that now precision layer to understand maybe what's been holding you up. Oh,
Yeah.
the second part, how often? In clinical work, we don't tend to do repeat EEGs that often. Okay, we use the patient's symptoms. Okay, that's where the subjectivity becomes very important, is to understand how they're responding to the interventions. Okay, and that could be a checklist. That could be just an interview to understand how they're doing. But yeah, typically we don't do too many repeat EEGs unless treatment isn't working, or there's still something left on the table. But yeah, usually not. We usually just get our baseline and sort of go from there. But in research, we will do sequential ones. In our research studies, we do that.
Thank you. Corey, I see your hand. I'm going to go to the second chat question and then I will pick on you. Megan Van Vliet asked, can you discuss these concepts in the context of big hormonal shifts, say in puberty and menopause when mental health often shifts?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great one. I know there's a group studying this specifically, hormonal shifts. And, now that the scientific literature is starting to recognize that there's, women as part of the study groups, they're doing this and they're getting whole studies of women and seeing the variations. I think in clinical practice, we tend to have paint with sort of broader strokes, and we don't need these sort of finite differences that come. But what we tend to see when it comes to shifts, and I think this is key, is that the baseline patterns tend to get aggravated. It usually doesn't create whole new patterns. It just amplifies the underlying baseline. Okay, so you may have a pattern that slows under load. We talked about that one. Okay, it slows under load. When that happens, and there's cycles of hormonal shifts, then we see that pattern aggravated. So it usually doesn't create a whole new slew of symptoms. It just aggravates those underlying patterns. So it still allows us to practice precision medicine, but in an understanding of a model that includes, hormones. And I think, again, as providers, we're talking about the brain here, but let's talk about the other stuff that's going on, below the surface, and let's clean some of that up. We call that kind of like the background noise. If we clean that up, again, that's the environment. So how do we do that so that that person can thrive with those brain patterns?
Beautiful. Thank you. All right, Corey, I'm going to ask you to unmute now. Oh, there you go. You're on it.
Thanks. Appreciate the talk. I signed in late, but I think I got the gist of it. And I'm an ex-engineer now, a family doc, but the concern I have is cost.
Yeah.
And I'm assuming that this is not standard medical care. Thus, insurance companies are very reluctant to cover any of the cost. How do I help my patients that have limited coverage or good coverage that doesn't pay for it, and help them figure out how to get this done? Because I'm a big guy with data. I love to see data.
Yeah, the engineers do. There's a brain pattern for that, Corey. We can measure that. I like your wood burning stove back there. I don't know if that's a background or if it's real, but that's pretty cool.
Unfortunately, it's gas, but
Oh, that's a cool stove. So cost. I'll give you the big picture and then the small one, of course. The costs continue to go down. Okay, we're continuing to work on making this go down as the systems become more efficient to do this. Okay, and so it takes less people, it takes less time, less computers, and so forth. So, clinics now, I've seen these run anywhere from 400 to 1,000 and that sort of range, depending on where you're at and your demographic. But I think the bigger picture is and again, it's kind of a philosophical question, but how much do you save by like the gentleman I told you was 85 years old and he was just getting relief then. So how much do we save by finding that information out now versus later? And I think those are some of the conversations that are worth having. Like, hey, I'm on the wrong medication for 2 years versus I get on. We talked about this in the book, actually. We had a girl who had been on 40 medications by the time she was 22, I think. And she ended up having a brain pattern that looked like it responded to a stimulant. It was like, a couple dollars a month, and in these treatment centers were like probably $10,000-$15,000 a month, So I don't mean to diminish, the person that you're speaking of, specifically, but, when you look at the bigger picture in terms of years of healthy life, it $400 or $500 is, some you have to weigh,
may I extend just a little bit?
Please.
So, and I'm not completely versed in the pharmacology and the biology of blood work and looking at receptors, DNA, that kind of stuff. How does this integrate in that picture where you could have the functional pattern of the brain pattern plus the pharmacology of receptors and cells?
I think there's a lot of cool work to be done there, Corey. Like when we started this project, AI was kind of this elusive thing, back in about 2017. And now as we start to combine things like genomics and other sorts of metabolic factors, I think we're going to see some interesting things come about there. I think that from what I've seen, and of course I have this sort of bias filter myself, but I've seen that the EEG information tends to be more clinically applicable than the genetic stuff. And we were one of the first to do that. We had piloted some of those genetic studies back in 2009 when we first started the clinic. And I remember one of the psychiatrists coming to me, and this was like way before we were even thinking about using EEG in this way. And he says, I really like using the EEG more than I like using the cheek swab and the genetic one. So we're gonna try this, and that kind of springboarded us into doing this more, this way. But I think there's a place for them, but how we metabolize medications versus how we, have these brain patterns that fit in an ecosystem and how they respond to meds is kind of a different language. So I think there's a place for both potentially.
Danielle asked another question. I know that we are at time. So if you need to drop off, go ahead and do so. Do you have a couple more minutes, Steve?
Yeah, I'm okay.
Okay. All right, Daniela, if a patient had brain surgery and possibly clips, etc., and scarring, how would that affect their EEG patterns?
Yeah, I mean, it'll definitely be a factor. I mean, you'll see usually in the areas where there was, trauma, just like a head injury, there'll be focal areas typically of slow activity and so forth. I think what's interesting about the brain, particularly in the landscape we're in now with the psychedelics, is this language of plasticity. And I think as we can integrate some of these really cool tools like the psychedelics, we can open up that window where damage may have occurred from a stroke or from a surgery or from a head injury. And I'm telling you, I wasn't a big like Kool-Aid drinker, psychedelic person, nothing when it started. And the stuff that I've seen is nothing short of miraculous. And that was on the subjective side. When we started to actually look at it through the lens of the EEG data, it was like undeniable that changes were happening. And so I think there could be a place for things like that where you combine some of these therapies like psychedelics or a short round of like maybe ketamine assisted therapy. And of course this isn't like advice, but you do that, and then you do your treatments to try to target those areas with some of these different like neuromodulation techniques like TMS or photobiomodulation or TDCS or these other sorts of tools that we're using now. So yeah, we should be able to pick up those areas and target them.
Beautiful. Well, I will send out an email the next day or two with a link to the recording of this webinar, as well as the deck that Dr. Rondo shared with us. And feel free to reach out if you have any other questions, and really appreciate you guys being here. Thank you so much, Dr. Rondo.
Thank you, Cassie.
Okay.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye.